I would also like to welcome Jonah Witt and her two daughters. She's a widow of Leon Witt, who was one of our SOG Sioux. She's a Mountain Yard lady and her family. Thank you for being here. B.G. Banquet is a military researcher, and he's a co-author of Stolen Valor, How Vietnam Generation Was Robbed of Its Heroes and Its History. Stolen Valor won the coveted William E. Colby Award for Outstanding Military Book, and Mr. Banquet also served as the co-chairman of the Texas Vietnam Memorial with former President Bush as honorary chairman. His work has been the object of 2 Reader's Digest stories, as well as award-winning pieces on ABC's 2020 and other national programs. He is a graduate of Vanderbilt University and the University of Tennessee. Mr. Banquet served in Vietnam with the 199th Light Infantry and was awarded the Bronze Star, Vietnamese Honor Medal, and Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry with Palm. In December 2003, Mr. Banquet was awarded the Distinguished Civilian Service Award, the highest award the Army gives a civilian, by former President George Bush at the Bush Presidential Library. In July 2005, Mr. Banquet was inducted in the U.S. Army Ranger Hall of Fame at Fort Benning, Georgia. Also in July 2005, Mr. Banquet and Congressman Salazar, Democrat, Colorado, introduced the Stolen Valor Act of 2005 on Capitol Hill. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Jug Banquet. Yeah.
All right, can you hear me? All right. I want to thank you for that introduction. I am extremely honored to merely be in this room, let alone be your guest speaker. I was just telling one of our active duty guests that so many people in our society don't understand that the people in this room are some of the greatest warriors this nation ever produced. Many of you know what my basic story is. I grew up in the Air Force. My father was an Air Force colonel. My senior year in college, I volunteered for the Army. Was in the 1st Armored Division at Fort Bragg. Had the dubious honor of going with a brigade into the Chicago riots, the Martin Luther King assassination, and after that I volunteered for Vietnam. Did my duty over there, got out the day I got home to go back to graduate school, got a master's, and went and became a stockbroker in Dallas, Texas. 1986, I was asked by several people to help raise the money. I was in the financial world. I knew the foundations. I knew where the money could be tapped to help raise the money for a Texas memorial. And, you know, stop and think about the current situation. World War II, we had a population of about 120 million. We were willing to pay the price, whatever it took to win the war. Vietnam, we had a population of about 200 plus million. We paid 58,000 and we pulled the plug. Now we lose 2,500 when we got 300 million, and already, you know, there are people sniping at them. If we had had the American press that we have today during World War II, 1 month before the landings at Normandy, the New York Times would have published the invasion plan. And then they would have told us they were completely rightful to do so because their rights under the amendment in the Constitution were guaranteed. Well, I've been doing this for a long time. And growing up, journalism to me was one of the greatest professions you could follow. I mean, what could be greater than to pursue the truth, find the truth, and tell it to America? Truth is what feeds a democracy. The debate, that's what debate is all about. That's what free forum speaking is all about, is for us to learn the truth and make a decision based upon the information we're given. The trouble today is journalism no longer ever uses the word truth. And I'm going to recount some battles I've had with some of the luminaries in the press. The word truth never comes out. The operative word today is accuracy. And when I first heard that, I thought, what the hell's the difference between accuracy and truth when you're talking the subject we're talking about? There is a very fundamental difference. Truth is absolute. It's irrefutable. It is. I mean, people can say they may not believe the truth, but they can't change it like a rock. It's there. Now, accuracy, they define as anything for which we cannot be sued. That is their definition. And by that, what I mean is that they can take somebody and they've got an agenda even before they start a story. So they can interview 100 people and 97 of them have one point of view and 3 of them have the point of view that they want to present. They completely and accurately quote the 3. And they present that in the press and say, you know, we didn't do anything and nobody can sue us because it was accurate. I've got a case I'm working right now where it appears on a television, national television program. They interviewed a soldier who was a recon guy, and the question put to him was something, and on the particular mission that they were talking about, this fellow wasn't on it, but he was just giving them background information and operational information and just the way things operated. The question to him was something like, you're on a mission, you're across the border, you run upon an enemy force, what do you do? And the man says, lady, we're recon, we're not there to fight anybody. He said, well, what would you do? We'd kill as many of them as we could and run like hell. Once that made television, of course, they quoted the man accurately, word for word, that's what he said. Except the question now is, you come on a civilian village with nothing but women and children, what do you do? Lady, we kill as many of them as we can and we run like hell. Now, you know, when I first started getting into this type of thing, I thought, this can't be right. They're not doing this kind of stuff. One of the first big programs that I ran into, and this is back, the memorial was in 1986, and I'll mention, you know, kind of how that memorial got me into these other things. But in 1988, Dan Rather did a documentary called The Wall Within. And it was about 6 Vietnam veterans out of Washington State who had been traumatized by the war. And he interviews each one of them and, you know, tell us what happened to you and what's your problem. One of the men was a Navy SEAL who was 16 years old in Vietnam. And his job was assassinations. And he was vivid about how he'd get an assignment and they'd go out and they'd assassinate, you know, various village chiefs, and then they would leave communist paraphernalia on the body to blame the communists, you know, but their job was to just keep stirring this stuff up. And Rather sits there, you know, of course, Rather reported Vietnam like this is just the gospel. And anyway, he goes through all 6 of these guys, and every one of them has got something similar. By that time, I had learned that a military record is a public document. The Freedom of Information Act operates and the Privacy Act operates. I can't get medical records, I can't get test scores, I can't get next of kin, I can't get addresses, but the chronological order of a man's military, the date of entry, the date of discharge, duty assignments, decorations. I can get general orders. I can get all that kind of stuff. Or I can. Anybody can. So I work on getting the records of these 6 individuals. 5 of them just made the story up. I mean, it was just made up wholesale. I did more research, and it turned out that they had interviewed in the vet centers in Washington State. The reason they went up there, they heard that hundreds of Vietnam veterans with post-traumatic stress were living in the woods, living as animals, howling at the moon type thing. Of course, they didn't find anybody like that. So then they went to the vet centers, and they interviewed almost 400 veterans before they picked these 6. One of them actually had been in Vietnam, and he was in the unit he said he was, and he was a Marine, and he had been in combat. He did have a combat action badges, but his stories were fallacious as hell, but I couldn't disprove them. But the other 5, I mean, it wasn't even close. I approached CBS, and the response was, we stand by the accuracy of our program. And that went on until Reader's Digest came calling one day, and I showed them that tape and showed them the records, and they ran the story in Reader's Digest. And of course, then CBS was sputtering all over themselves. And that documentary had become part of Walter Cronkite's History of the Vietnam War that CBS donated to hundreds of schools, and they were selling in the video stores. They never admitted it, but they quietly withdrew that package of tapes from the video stores and then reissued it. The Wall Within is no longer in it. But, you know, I started to learn lessons each time I do one of these things. I knew Dan Rather, and this was later confirmed by, I forgot his name now, the book guy that did Bias, Bernie Goldberg. He tells stories in there about Rather, whenever he'd get mad about something, he'd say, by God, I'm a 2-tour Marine and I'm not taking this anymore. And everybody just thought, boy, he's badass Marine and he's going to kick our butt, et cetera, et cetera. I wonder what he did in the military. I get his record. He joined the reserves while he was at Sam Houston University in Texas to avoid the draft. Because in those days, you could be drafted out of college. You didn't get a 4-year deferment. All you got to do is complete the semester you were in. Second the war ended, he drops out of the reserves. Another year of school. He then goes into the Marine Corps to go to OCS, and he's in basic training, and he can't do the physical activity, and they kick him out of the Marine Corps for being medically unfit. This is your 2-tour Marine at CBS. One of the ironies of that was that, fast forward the election, my last name is Burkett, my first initial's B, I'm from Texas, and those phony documents that he was provided came from a Lieutenant Colonel B. Burkett of Texas, who was a guy in the National Guard who is no relation to me whatsoever. But I must have gotten 15, 20 calls from national media wanting to know if I had really finally nailed Rather for good. And unfortunately, I have to say I had nothing to do with that. The episode of raising the money for this memorial, again, I was a stockbroker. I knew the foundations. I knew the Perot's. I'd go down the list of people that I thought would say this is a worthy cause and we'll give you money. Everybody I approached, and we have a ton of defense contractors in Texas. Bell Helicopter and Chance Vought and General Dynamics, and it goes on and on and on. And I'm figuring they're going to write me a check just for me showing up and explaining what the project is. Every outfit said, why should we give money to those bums, meaning Vietnam veterans? And I was flabbergasted, and it wasn't just once, it was every single place. Some of them were diplomatic, some of them weren't. Some of them literally threw me out of the office, and they would quote these statistics about all the homeless were Vietnam veterans. There's 600,000 of them in prison. There, over 100,000 have committed suicide. I mean, it just went on and on and on about how they were unemployed, unemployable, ex-con, drug addicts, child molesters, you name it. I'm a pragmatic stockbroker. I do stock research. I don't sell stuff just by saying I picked it off the shelf, buy it. I do the research. I did the research. I went to the Labor Department, and I said, look, I need statistics on Vietnam veterans. Sharon Kahaney, an economist there, and I think she may still be doing it, but she does an annual report on male unemployment in the United States. It comes out annually, and it's about 50 pages long. And it breaks down the male American society in just about every way you can imagine, but there wasn't anything in there about veterans. And she, when I approached her, she says, you know what, we actually have that data. We've got it broken down by eras, peacetime, Korea, World War II, the whole bit. I'm going to publish that. Yeah, it's a good idea. You know, we just never thought it was that relevant. The thing came out when unemployment, it came out about 4 months later, unemployment was 6% in the American economy. Among all veterans, it was 5.5%. Among Vietnam veterans, it was 3.9%. But the active duty military is not included in these statistics. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnam veterans were still actively employed, but in the military. If you added them into the numbers, the unemployment figure for Vietnam veterans dropped to almost 3%. The unemployment rate of Vietnam veterans was half the male population. And I major in economics, and I can tell you any society, if I want to know one statistic about that society to tell you something about that society, it's the employment rate of males. One of the major reasons we have a terrorist problem is in many of those Muslim countries, 70% of the 18 to 25-year-old males are unemployed. They got a business, they got a job, they got a paycheck, they got a family. They're not making bombs going out and blowing up people. At least most of them would. So, the light went on, and I keep, working with her. Not only was their unemployment rate that low, or our unemployment rate, Vietnam veterans had the highest educational rate of any major group, male group in America. I mean, in terms of, you're not talking PhDs, but 90% of Vietnam veterans had a high school degree, and of course many of them have advanced degrees. 71% used the GI Bill after the war for some element of education. May have been trade school, may have been GED, whatever it is. The education level was very high. Because of the education level, they had the highest per capita income of any major group in America. Highest home ownership rate. Divorce rate was identical to our male civilians that didn't go in the military. And while I'm doing all this, I'm doing a lot of comparisons to World War II. The World War II GIs, only 45% of them had a high school degree. And we get into things like the suicide rates. Oh my God, more of them have killed themselves than died in the war. Over 100,000 have killed themselves. So I work with the Center for Disease Control and the VA, which have statistics. I mean, veterans die, they get reported. The suicide rate after a man came home, or a group of men came home, was slightly higher for the first 2 years after they got back. And that has happened after every war. They've got readjustment problems. Some of them were in the reserves and they lost their business. Their wife ran off with their buddy. I mean, whatever it is, it was slightly higher. Since that 2-year time frame elapsed, the suicide rate among Vietnam veterans is one of the lowest in the country. It is significantly lower than our male counterparts who never went in the military. And a surprising statistic, which has, sounds worse than it is, but as the age advances and people hit 70 and 80, the suicide rate explodes. The World War II generation right now has a suicide rate 4 times higher than Vietnam vets. But it's not because their rate is higher than non-vets, it's just because of the age, what happens at the age. I went through the draft. Oh, but all those poor boys that got killed were black draftees from the ghetto. World War II, there were 50 million men in the draft pool. 50 million. And I grew up in the military. Every man on my street was a World War II vet. I believe that every able-bodied man fought in World War II, the greatest generation. You go to the Selective Service and some of the government agencies and get the data, 50 million were registered for the draft. Now, their draft went up to 35, where ours only went to 26. Out of that group, only 5 million voluntarily enlisted. 20 million draft notices were sent. Almost half of those who got draft notices flunked the aptitude test or the physical. Out of the 50 million, only 16 million got inducted. That leaves an awful lot of potential wannabes at home that fought in the big one. And I actually used a few years ago, check the obituaries in the Dallas Morning News of the World War II guys. And I gave it up because now it's just they fill pages because there's so many of them. But of the ones I checked over a period of several months, over half of them were bogus as hell. These were guys that just made them up. And, you know, you take Charles Durning as a character actor, was on, I can't even think of some of the programs he's on, but he's won several awards. But the VA has him every year do the ceremonies in Washington, the MC for Veterans Day, Memorial Day, and all that. He goes on and on about his days on Normandy Beach and killing 8 Germans and killing a kid with a rock and bayoneting another guy. I got his military record. The guy was in the States when Normandy was going on. He just made up the whole Normandy story. He also claims that he was captured at Normandy, which he was never in, you know, any unit at Normandy or the one unit that was massacred at Normandy. I kept working my way through these statistics at the time to, well, another one, big one for our generation was race. You know, the minorities disproportionately got killed in the war. You get the data, and that's not what happened at all. Among the black race at the time was roughly 10.5% of the population. But black women tend to have children at a younger age, and they tend to have per capita more children. So among males, draft age males, in that universe, they were 13.5% of that population. They suffered 12.5% of the casualties in Vietnam, 1% less than their demographics, not more. Now, having said that, there were thousands of black officers, college degrees served in Vietnam. And I tell you, I served with some of the finest. There was one point in the 199th where my commanding general was black. These are all college educated. My commanding general was black. My battalion commander was black. My company commander was black. And 2 of the 4 platoon leaders were black. 20 blacks were awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam. And once in the military, blacks in the Vietnam generation tended to volunteer for combat units at a much greater rate than whites. Oh, yeah, but all those college kids got draft deferments and they didn't go in. Well, an MIT group did a study on those killed in action. Among the top 1/3 of the American population in terms of economic strata, they did suffer slightly less. They suffered 27% of the casualties when the expectation, if it was equal, would be 33%. But they also looked at the other 2/3, the bottom third, you know, the economically disadvantaged that we kept hearing were fighting the war and dying. They didn't suffer 33% of the casualties. They suffered 30% of the casualties. The disproportionate portion was the white middle class suffered higher casualties in their demographic numbers. But where have you ever seen that in the press or heard it in the histories? The things like desertions, I mean, I mentioned that were 55% higher. Atrocities. During Vietnam, the 10 years of Vietnam, there were about 600 alleged crimes of what would be called atrocities and war crimes. The 600 out of 3.3 million. If I went to any police chief in this country and offered him those statistics for the next 10 years, he'd say, hallelujah, I could fire 2/3 of my police department. It would be the lowest crime rate in America. And many of those cases that were reported were found to be completely unfounded. Now, the big problem is My Lai. Total tragedy, total everything. And I address that in the book. That was not a standard unit. You know, they make it sound like it was Joe Q America in that unit. They weren't. They were formed typically by a lot of them, other than the cadre, but the rank and file were misfits. I was at Fort Hood when one unit was formed, and they'd put out an allocation to an infantry company of 10 men, 20 men, and the company commander, Sergeant, have we filed those charges yet? Tear them up. Smith is going to another unit. Now, the Army has always done that. This is nothing new. They probably did it in the Revolution. That's how they'll form a new unit. And then what happened, though, is they trained them. They all go to Vietnam. And at Fort Hood, they rioted the last day. They tore up the main drag of the post and blew out all the windows in the headquarters building. And they court-martialed them all on the ships on the way over to Vietnam, you know, the entire voyage. They get to Vietnam, they're all coming home the same day, so we now do mix and match. We take 600 of them and send them to the 1st Infantry. 1st Infantry sends back 600 with staggered deroast dates. Do you think the 1st Infantry sent the best guys? They went through the same process saying, you know, get the misfits out of here and send them down to the Americal Division. The Army knew they had a problem. They just didn't know it was going to be as massive and as horrific as it was. I examined atrocities in World War II. In 11 months, there were almost 1,000 GIs in Europe court-martialed for capital crimes, mostly against civilians. Almost all of them were convicted. 443 were condemned to death and 96 were executed. Don't see that in the history books. You know, and I've got the case files and I've got the names, I got the service numbers of the guys that were executed. Any event, I'm doing that statistical work for no other reason than to raise the money. You know, I get now saying, no ma'am, that's not true, and I go through the process. We raised the money. Bush Sr. came down and dedicated the memorial. Texas Memorial is the only Vietnam memorial in the country dedicated by a U.S. president. The Reagan administration boycotted the National Memorial. Very few people seem to be aware of that. There was no Secretary of Defense, no Vice President, no Joint Chiefs of Staff. The highest ranking official there was Everett Alvarez, who was an Undersecretary of the VA, and he, of course, the POW. The final ceremony, or that ceremony of the dedication, we had 65 separate news services from around the world because Bush was there. And not one of those news agencies interviewed any of the veterans who had built the memorial. All of us were business executive types in town. I had a dignitary section where I had hundreds of local Vietnam veterans from North Texas. Sam Johnson, the POW, is now a congressman. Roger Staubach. I mean, you go down the list of a dozen politicians, council members, and all that. I had dozens and dozens of chief executive officers of major corporations in North Texas. Not one of them was interviewed. They went behind the ropes and they interviewed several guys with the bandanas and the fatigues and the ponytails. And they were local guys. And I knew every one of them. I checked. None of them were Vietnam veterans. But those were the guys that ended up on the evening news. So that episode it got me so mad, I thought I got to do something. And this data I've never consolidated, never organized it or what. So I started to organize it. While I'm doing that, or during the memorial itself, there was a murder in Dallas in which headline was, Vietnam Veteran Goes Berserk. I get the guy's military record. The guy was never in Vietnam. He got kicked out of the Navy on a psychological discharge in 4 months. Edmond, Oklahoma, killing 14 postal workers. Vietnam veteran goes berserk. And the guy killed 14 people, killed himself. 7 men, 7 women victims. I got his military record. The guy was never in Vietnam. 2 of the 7 male victims were Vietnam War heroes. They did a full-page story on each one of the 14 over a 2-week period. Not one mention was ever made of these fellows being in Vietnam and being decorated for valor. The newspaper considered it a negative to mention that they were in Vietnam. From that point on, I started checking every single story that would pop up. I used to go to the library at night. They had all these New York Times and everything on microfilm checking stories. The story after story after story started popping up. Joe Yandel, Boston, murder in prison. He founded a chapter of the VVA, the Vietnam Veterans of America in Prison. Now, the VVA, and I'm sure some of you belong to it, and you know, some of the greatest guys in the world in it, but most people are in it don't understand who founded that organization. It was the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And they have over 100 chapters in prisons where they recruit murderers, rapists, pedophiles, and every deviant under the sun. And if you ever run a full roster of one of their chapters, which I did in Dallas, I mean, I thought the damn, Dalton gang had come to town. I had bank robbers, I had murderers, I had rapists, and I had half of them weren't Vietnam veterans. The president at the time was a guy named Testa, who was a national committee member, Testa. And I got his military record. He deserted. He had a Silver Star, and he was advisor to a couple of congressmen, walked with a cane, a limp because of his wound. Got his record. He deserted from Fort Polk in basic training, picked up a teenage girl, like 14 in California, stole a trailer, got caught and went to prison for 6 or 7 years, and had multiple arrests and incarcerations in Texas. Never served, obviously, in Vietnam or anywhere else. The next guy that was in the VVA that I hit was a national committee chairman, and he was also an advisor to Congressman John Bryan. particularly on veterans issues like post-traumatic stress and Agent Orange poisoning, which he claimed had happened to him. He had cancer, and he testified in front of Congress. I got his military record. He'd been in the Coast Guard. He'd made one cruise to Honolulu where he got kicked out for dealing drugs. Never served in Vietnam. I exposed him in a front-page article in the Dallas Morning News. 1 month later, the VVA chapter elected him their president. About that same time, I checked 3 individuals running for the president of the Vietnam Veterans of America. One of them was a lawyer who everybody thought had a tour in Vietnam, and he never made any claim except that he was a Vietnam veteran. Turned out he had about 14 days on TDY as a JAG advisor on a court-martial, which, I mean, there's nothing disgraceful about that, but he wasn't as they seemed to think he was. The other 2 were both convicted killers, one of whom was still in prison while he was running for the president of the VVA. You go down, Joe Yandel in Boston, another VVA member in prison, founded the chapter in Massachusetts State Prison, was in there for life without parole. VVA starts a drive to get him out of prison because poor Joe was a hero at Quezon, and he suffered enough, and he had post-traumatic stress, and he had been in for over a dozen years. The Boston Globe does 30 positive references to the guy. They commemorated his birth date, and he was back in the Dukakis governorship era when they used to let these guys out. Willie Horton, the old guys, remember him? He's the guy that he used to let murderers go home on the weekend for furloughs until Willie Horton killed somebody else, and they thought maybe that's not a good idea. Well, Joe Yandel fathered 2 kids, at least he thought he did, until he found out his girlfriend had been cheating on him, and one of them wasn't his. But they do this big push to get him out of prison, and Mike Wallace does 3 different pieces on Yandel on 60 Minutes. I'd already gotten his military record, notified the governor's office. The guy was in the brig in Yorktown for tearing up the enlisted man's club, and the only place he served overseas was in a warehouse in Okinawa. And all the documents he had, he'd forged in prison. And what better place to find a master forger than in prison? 1 month later, the governor commuted his sentence and gave a press conference because Joe was such a war hero. I confronted Wallace with this, and they admitted, oh yes, it looks like we made a mistake, and they said they were going to retract it. You know, I had 4 different conversations with him, and nothing. I took it to ABC. They ran it on a Friday night. Yandel went back to prison on Saturday morning, and he's still there. Patrick Kennedy, the congressman, you know, the DWI guy at the Capitol, Teddy's son, he went to bat for a guy named Bruce Cotta who thought he should have gotten a Medal of Honor. And they submit the witness statements, the Army turns them down. And Cotta did serve in Vietnam. They submit it again, get John Kerry to endorse it because the guy was born in Massachusetts. The Army turns it down again. 3 weeks later, Kennedy gets a packet saying, we've reconsidered, we're awarding Distinguished Service Cross, big ceremony. Kennedy runs a bill through Congress, names a post office after the guy. He's lecturing at all the colleges in Massachusetts, Annapolis, several of the Naval War colleges, this type of thing. I get a copy from the Legion of Valor of his general order, and it's forged. And I figured out he had forged the entire packet himself, and I even figured out where he bought the medal off the internet. And Kennedy was about ready to have a kitten because he had the dedication of the post office coming up, the Bruce Cotta post office. So he goes to bat for Cotta and gets the whole thing just wiped away. Cotta made a public apology and paid like $5 grand to some military charity, and he doesn't even have an arrest record. I've got several congressmen that have done exactly the same thing. You know, Walsh of New York gave a guy a Distinguished Service Cross. I got that sucker convicted in federal prison. And after he confessed on the stand, he comes out on the courthouse steps. Now, he claimed to be special ops, too, by the way. A guy named Goff. He comes out on the courthouse steps and said, well, yes, I told the judge what I had to tell him because I'm sworn to secrecy, and the penalty for violating my contract is my life in prison. He got a standing ovation from the locals, and I got hate mail from months, including from the city librarian, who thought I had maligned this great American hero. Larry Cable. Cable was a professor at the University of North Carolina, and he was an expert on counterinsurgency. He wrote a book about it. The military had hired him at the Marine Corps University. He got $3,000 a month for lecturing at the command and staff schools. Air Force had him at the Air Commando School, and his story was not only did he have these academic credentials, but he had a battlefield commission in Vietnam, and when he got out of his tour, he went back to work with the CIA in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. And the guy, it was unbelievable to watch all these military guys in uniform listening to this guy, which I went to one of his presentations. He had hair that went down to his waist, completely unbraided, no ponytail, nothing. He wore sandals and a serape and walked with a staff. I mean, and had a bush hat. I mean, he had like Moses, and wherever he'd go, all these little academics would follow behind him. And he was entertaining. The guy was a great lecturer. And I go and check his military record. Not only did he never serve in the military, he got kicked out of college in the 10th grade. And when I met him, he had just come back from Europe lecturing the NATO commander, the chiefs of staff on counterinsurgency. And I can only wonder how many senior officers today in Iraq took this course back when they were majors and lieutenant colonels. Each of the services I notified, they quietly canceled his contract, but Marines they get mad at me because he was the lecturer of the year and I had ruined their program. And the colonel who was there, the commander who was running the school, calls me up, and he basically called me a liar and said that this man stayed in his house, and the colonel, was a two-tour Marine in Vietnam. And I said, Colonel, I almost said, you can't be that stupid. But I told him to go check the record. He called me back. He didn't give me an apology, but he was totally upset that I was going to use his name in my book. Then the chief academic calls me up, the civilian, and says, we got to have a counterinsurgency expert. And the program starts in 3 weeks. And I said, let me tell you something. You pay me $3,000 a week, and I'll come up and make up whatever stories you want me to. Okay. I talk too much, as any of you know me. The bottom line is that this is not a Vietnam phenomenon. I mean, I in some ways, I take credit for letting people know that there is such a phenomenon. It's happened after every single war. You know, there was a guy, the last Civil War veteran diver was from Texas. An academic checks his record. The guy just made it up to get a bonus back in the 30s. So he went to the next guy, same thing. He had to go back through 12 of these guys before he found the last real Civil War veteran. And he was a Yankee named something like Woolsey, I think out of, I believe, Michigan. I met with an academic up in Canada. My dad was born in Canada, came to the States when he was young, naturalized. And he had just finished a book on Billy Bishop. I mean, he's the greatest hero of the Canadian Armed Forces. They've named their military headquarters after the guy. This academic proves that Billy Bishop would go, most of his missions, like 90% plus, were single plane missions. He would land his plane behind French lines, take his, they'd dismount the machine gun, blow a few holes in his tail, and then come back and claim a couple of Jerry's shot down. He got the Victoria Cross for strafing and destroying planes on the ground and then shooting out of the air the 4 that took off the ground. The academic gets all the German records. That airstrip was never attacked and they never lost an aircraft. The guy just made up the whole thing. And of course, he's taking a lot of the same kind of flack that I'm taking here. I mean, that I do in what I do. But the bottom line is our press is somewhat brain dead when it comes to these types of subjects. They do not do their research, and once you prove them wrong, they virtually will never retract the story or print a correction. And you guys, you are the most imitated bunch in America, as you well know. Everybody was in MACSOG, Special Operations, Special Forces, on and on and on. And I can make you a guarantee. Once every single one of you are dead and in the grave, there is still going to be a generation of these guys that are going to be the last Green Berets to die from the Vietnam War. Thank you.
I want to turn it. There we go. Okay. Jug, we appreciate your coming to be our guest speaker. I thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to present you with the coin, the SOAR 30 coin that we had produced for this reunion, being our 30th year.
I can convince everybody I was in special operations.
Yeah, now he says he can convince everybody he was in special operations. The plaque that we have to present has our motto on it: "You have never lived until you've almost died. For those who have fought for it, life has a special flavor the protected will never know."
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
It also says, "Presented to B.G. Jug Banquet in appreciation for valor vindicated. Guest speaker, SOAR 30, September 28, 2006.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.
Also, we voted Jug an honorary member of the Special Operations Association. So I present you with your certificate of membership as an honorary member, and your life membership card. Jug is SOA honorary member number 2561, honorary life, 2006.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Unbelievable.
Let me take that with you and protect them. We come now to the special presentation part of our program, and we have some people to recognize who have served us well. And first of all is our past executive director, Jake Jacobson. Jake, would you come up, please? You hear that, Jake? They want to know who the hell is Jake Jacobson. Come on up here, Jake. Don't be bashful. I owe a personal debt of thanks to Jake. Being president is really easy when you have a man who is dedicated, who is as good a friend, and who you can always depend on, who will always take the initiative to pick up the slack so you won't look bad because you forgot something. And that's Jake. I don't have to tell Jake anything that I needed done. Once he got in the groove, Jake really defined the position of executive director. Jake is our first executive director. In my military career and in my 15 years of Special Forces, I can't think of a man who is more well respected than Jake Jacobson. And I sincerely mean that. So the board of directors thought that we should award Jake the Jim Butler Founders Award for achievement. It is awarded for extraordinary achievement in service to the Special Operations Association. And Jake, what I have on here is it says, "You define the position of the Executive Director, SOA, by your unselfish dedication, loyalty, and exemplary performance of duty. This is the third award at SOAR 30, September 28, 2006. Jake, you certainly earned it, and I certainly am proud to award it to you." Pardon me?
I say so?
Sure. Go ahead. I don't know what I do with it.
I read someplace, or somebody told me that there's 3 basic ingredients to classifying a job as being good. That was, you had to enjoy what you were doing, you had to enjoy doing it, enjoy the people you're doing it with, and you had to enjoy the place you're doing it at. SOA contributed all three of those to my job. Thank you.
Thank you, Jake. Now we all know who Jake Jacobson is. Next, I'd like to ask Bulldog Smith to come forward. David. David is our outgoing secretary. David's been around the SOA for quite some time. He's always been there, dedicated, and always willing to do what it takes to support me and the organization. It's hard to put words to things like that, so I didn't do that, David. I didn't try to wordsmith and be very articulate and so on, which I'm not. So I just said, presented to David Bulldog Smith an appreciation for your dedicated service to the Special Operations Association, September 2000 to September 2006. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Yeah. At this time, I would like to ask Paul Warden of America Remembers and Jeffrey Belcher of America Remembers to come forward, please. Come on up here, guys. America Remembers has been a long-time supporter of the Special Operations Association and Special Operations Association scholarship program. They basically have designed the weapons that we are raffling off today, or at least this configuration of the weapons. And at this point, then, I'd like to stop and ask Don Benjamin to come up. Because Don, who in the heck is Don Benjamin? Huh? Don, early on, and it's been some 10 years that this program started, was our project officer in this situation and in what we were having done. Those weapons have done very well. They're really masterpieces, and they depict us. And so I thought, before we raffled them off tonight, that I would ask Paul and Jeffrey to come up and Don to come up and help me, because I wanted to award them the coin from SOAR 30 for each of you. The honorary membership to both Paul and Jeff. But I know that Paul and Jeff are not the only people in America Remembers. And as many times as I've tried to call the folks at America Remembers, and Jeffrey's name is spelled really funny. It's spelled Jeffery. Don told me that's the way it was spelled. I said, no, that don't sound right. He said, yeah, that's what he told me. I went to their webpage and they got it spelled wrong. They got it spelled Jeffery. Right? That's correct. And so then again, we went back to the drawing board and had to do the membership cards and so on. But at any rate, I got that information from the secretary when I called. And I know that there are other people at America Remembers, so I wanted to give them a plaque to hang up so that it would be a thank you to all of America Remembers. It says, presented to America Remembers, an appreciation for your long-standing support of the Special Operations Association George C. Morton Scholarship Award, awarded September 28, 2006. And I'd like to present that to Paul, the president of America Remembers. and along with your life membership card. Paul? Jeffrey. Jeffrey actually is the project manager who did the work that Paul told him to do on the weapons. And so he's the one that, I don't know who's the artistic genius or has all the imagination, but they're fine weapons. In the time that we have had these weapons, between royalties, the raffles that we've run, including this one, we have received about $90,000 for our scholarship program. Paul, thank you very much. Jeffrey, Don, I don't have anything for you.
I don't want anything.
I gave Don one of my old TVs. He's going to take it home with him when he goes home. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it. I would like to ask now George Clark of STMP, the president of STMP, and Solvega Unger, our parliamentarian, to come forward. Just stand right there. That's good. That's good, yeah. Solvega sort of joined our organization when times were really tough back in 1998 and 1999. Many of you remember that. I will never forget that. It was some tough years. One of the big things that happened that year was it was recommended by Charles Berg that we get a parliamentarian. And through some chains of things that happened, phone calls to people, Solvega Unger came to us. Now I understand there's some members, because I heard it, that think that Solvega does not know what she's doing because they told her so. Thanks to you, when you told her, oh, shut up and sit down, it ended it. Things got better ever since. But Solvega is a professional parliamentarian, and she charges for her services when she comes. And of course, her wages get less and less as the general membership meetings get shorter and shorter. And because we don't argue and fight at the board of directors meetings anymore, we don't even have her come to the board of directors meeting. But Solvega always donates back her wages, if you will, or her payment, stipend, back to either the SOA, and in this case, to STMP. And so I asked George to come up, and Min Pang Tin,
President.
He's a president. That's what I thought. But I didn't want to misquote that. But anyway, I wanted to ask them to come up and to have Solvega award the check to them. It's for $300 to the STMP for their land fund.
They would like to make a presentation of her.
Okay. Min is making a presentation of a Mountain Yard bracelet to Solvega. And he has sent me a letter some time back that had told everything that was, all the designs on the bracelet, and I will pass that on to her. Min, thank you very much. Appreciate it. George, thank you. And Solvega, thank you very much.
Been great.
I would like to go back over, because I missed it the first time. I screwed it up the second time. Carrie Wesley, where are you at? Would you stand up, please? She's not here. Carrie Wesley is the wife of Charles Wesley, and I really wanted to go back over this because West didn't deserve for me to screw this up. So I just wanted to bring that back. Basically, that concludes for tonight our program. We'll now retire the colors, and so I'd ask you to please stand while the Nellis Air Force Base Color Guard, Honor Guard, comes forward to recover the colors, or retire the colors. Gentlemen. Present. Port out. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. We'll take a short break now, and then we'll come back for the raffling of the pistols and some other items. Thank you.